I'm Afshin Ratansia. We're going underground as the US Senate votes on President Trump's nominee, Judge Amy Coney Barrett, to the Supreme Court, who could tip the balance in upcoming votes on criminal justice, including claims against excessive police force. Coming up in the show. As billionaires' wealth rises to over $10 trillion amid the epoch-making coronavirus pandemic, we investigate the global police state as it seeks to protect private profit at the expense of humanity. And as bills pass through the UK Parliament that seek to immunise soldiers and undercover police from facing justice, we investigate a new film, Ultra-Violence, that explores the collision of endless war and endless police brutality and why it requires endless resistance. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, Britain finally faces up to something of the alleged war crimes committed during the so-called Troubles today, as a parliamentary committee releases a report into the legacy of bloodshed in Ireland. It's long been alleged that British Army techniques employed in illegal British wars like the one in Iraq were honed in Ulster. A new book traces the past, present and future of state coercion and its critical connection to global capital. Joining me now from Los Angeles is the author of The Global Police State, Professor William I. Robinson. Thank you so much, William, for coming on. We got a hint, arguably, of the global police state from WikiLeaks. They released the Iraq war logs 10 years ago this week, this month. What is the global police state, the title of your book?
I mean three things by global police state, but let me put that in context by saying the starting point for the discussion of global police state needs to be this severe crisis of global capitalism. The pandemic didn't create the crisis. It only made it much worse. And in talking about global police state, there's two dimensions I want to highlight. One is the structural. Technically, we call that overaccumulation, but it's a crisis of chronic stagnation in the global economy. And the second dimension of that crisis is political. It's one of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. So I mean three things by global police state. And the first is we see the deepening and the extension worldwide of transnational systems of social control, of repression, militarization, and warfare all around the world. And we see that in order to contain the real and the potential rebellion of what I call in the book surplus humanity, and the mass of the downwardly mobile and destabilized and increasingly impoverished global working class. And, you know, very quickly, the International Labor Organization has already reported that 1/3 of humanity, that 2 billion people in the world are at this point what I call surplus humanity, structurally marginalized, unemployed, that have to scratch out a living in an informal economy, which is deteriorating and collapsing. And then another 1.3 billion workers in the world work in extremely precarious conditions. So we have 1/2 of humanity is in this immiserated situation.
You're immediately talking about class. You see, when this program suggested that class warfare may exist, it made the Murdoch Times newspaper. But you quote Warren Buffett claiming it's been going on for decades, class war, and his class won. Tell me about this connection between class and the global police state, then, more clearly.
Sure. Well, let's look at it. Global inequalities have reached unprecedented levels. I mean, we can barely wrap our minds around these inequalities. 1% of humanity controls over 50% of the world's wealth. That we know because that's been broadly publicized. But more significantly, 20% of humanity, and that amount is shrinking as world capitalism continues to restructure, controls 95% of the world's wealth. So 80% of humanity controls only 5% of the world's wealth. And under those conditions, under these conditions of extreme inequality, those that rule the world, including Warren Buffett, need to develop systems of extreme control and repression. But, you know, I want to add one other thing when we talk about Warren Buffett and what I refer to in the book as the transnational capitalist class. And the second dimension of global police state is independent of the system's need to repress and to wage wars and so forth to hold the mass of humanity down. Global police state is immensely profitable at a time when the global economy has been in chronic stagnation. And so we see that the whole global economy and society is increasingly dependent on militarization, on wars, on transnational social control, just to keep the global economy moving forward.
You use the phrase military Keynesianism. I should say you also mentioned the fact that Citibank said invest in luxury goods because there's no point in investing in things that aren't luxury for that elite. Military Keynesianism, do you see that as the core project now of neoliberal governments?
That's one of the arguments of the book, and I go beyond military Keynesianism. We've had that since the post-World War II period, the 1960s and 1970s. I call it militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. And here, the data on how the global economy is more and more just dependent on this accumulation by repression and by militarization is mind-boggling. The Middle Eastern wars that you mentioned briefly at the beginning of the program have already involved 15 trillion dollars. The military budgets of governments around the world increased 100% from 2001 to the present. 100%, and that only includes official military forces budgets. We also have the vast increase of state secret budgets, of police and intelligence budgets, homeland security budgets. When you add all of this up, and I put this in the book, you're talking about 4, 5, or maybe a little more percentage of the entire world economy. And this doesn't include this incredible expansion of investments in the global police state by private forces. We have now 20 million people that work for private mercenary firms. Technically, they're called private military firms. We have 15 million people that work as private police all around the world, and that number's more than public police forces in one half of the countries in the world. We have the wildly profitable so-called war on terror and war on drugs, which are a farce because they're not against drugs and they're not really against terrorism. So I can go on and on, of course, because there's a massive amount
the
of
war
data in the
the
book.
war on drugs, of course, spearheaded by the Democrat contender for the presidency. You're speaking to me from Los Angeles. Do you think there is a growing consciousness of the issues in the book? Because you've talked about battle spaces changing from, I suppose, Iraq to our towns and cities, and you're in LA. You saw, presumably, the Black Lives Matter protests after the killing of George Floyd in your city.
Saw and participated here in Los Angeles. There were tens of thousands every single day, up to 100,000 in some mass marches, and largely youth driven. But the global police state has been on full display here in the United States in the uprising that took place in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. But the larger story here, of course, is the mega cities of the world, not just the hot war zones such as in the Middle East. The mega cities of the world are now the theaters for this global police state, and it's where these inequalities are so incredibly acute. And so all of the panoply of what I'm referring to as global police state is unleashed in these megacities. And I keep on wanting to emphasize here that part of that is to hold down the mass of humanity from questioning this system and rebelling in the face of unprecedented inequality.
On the culture, and of course, in fairness to so-called mainstream media, they did cover the BLM protests quite a lot. Tell me about how you describe liberal cultural elites facilitating this global police state. You actually use the phrase neo-fascist culture.
Yes, absolutely. And so, the third dimension, I had mentioned the first dimension of global police state is this repressive element. The second is simply that it's enormously profitable to invest in wars and repression and so forth. The third dimension is this threat of what I refer to as 21st century fascism. But the confusion here is that's just like the extreme far right wing, these far right wing neo-fascist parties in Europe or Modi in India or Trump here in the United States. On the contrary, these repressive systems and the investment in them is Democratic and Republican. Here in the United States, it's completely bipartisan. The liberal elite has been deeply invested in global police state.
You mean Hollywood, you mean novels, you mean theater, you mean television.
Well, that is the level of the mass media, the entertainment industry. And yes, they put forward images and ideology and glorify what I'm referring to as a global police state. But, and the book is loaded with so much data, you can just scratch the surface here. But let's remember something here, that U.S. military and intelligence agencies financed and advised, and this is in the book, here's the data, 800 major Hollywood movies in recent years and 1,000 TV shows. And all of this projects all kinds of images that are related to beefing up this global police state at the ideological and cultural level with its political and economic implications, of course.
You see, you do try and end the book on something quite hopeful, but what emancipatory spirit can be summoned up if more and more of us are out of work, let alone because of coronavirus? Labor unions, even if they did strengthen in numbers, don't have that power. I mean, what is supposed to overthrow the global police state as their coercion prevents people being able to meet?
Well, there's two things. A global revolt has already been underway, and the fall of 2019 was what we could call a worldwide spring of revolts everywhere in the world. The pandemic pushed people off the street temporarily, but people are now back on the street. The Nigerian, we were up to, we don't even know how many Nigerians were mowed down in a hail of bullets by the police in Nigeria, but they're rising up first against police brutality and more generally against the social economic policies that generate global police states. So we do have a global rebellion underway, and that is very hopeful. But we also have some of the global elites are recognizing that we need a massive redistribution of wealth and power downward in order to save capitalism from itself, not even to overthrow capitalism. That's really what we need as a first step is a massive decreasing of those unprecedented inequalities, and we need a rebuilding of social programs around the world. We need a new type of a global New Deal and a radical reform of global capitalism. Would prefer it be overthrown, but put that aside. And the good news is that masses of people are now taking to the streets and organizing worldwide for that global reform project. And they are meeting up with certain sectors of the global elite, which see that this reform is urgent if the system is not going to either collapse or be overthrown, or to generate into mass anarchy.
Well, just finally and briefly, the other existential question, of course, the environment. You say in the book the Green New Deal is a kind of vacuous saving of capitalism, and the inference is, of course, the police state as well. Why do you see something like the Green New Deal as just another liberal construct, which is not really getting to the heart of things at all?
Right. No, there's two things. Not the Green New Deal. I support the Green New Deal, and that's a big step forward. It's rather this notion of green capitalism, that the giant corporations that basically run the planet do more. It's more about public relations than actually contributing to a whole transformation of our social and economic system so that it is environmentally sustainable. So that's so-called green capitalism. And, you have like British Petroleum, BP, saying that they're shifting all their, they're going to be renewable in the next 10, 20 years, which is, of course, a lot of nonsense. So I'm critiquing the notion of green capitalism, that the big giant transnational corporations and the elites, which are often their political agents, are going to salvage us from the ecological collapse that we're already in. But a Green New Deal, I think, is a very important step forward. But a Green New Deal calls for massive redistribution of wealth downward and massive reform and controls on the unbridled operations of the transnational corporate elite.
Well, BP says it's very green. Modi and Trump, of course, say they aren't fascists. Professor William I. Robinson, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
After the break, ultra-violence. After global protests against racist policing appear to slow in the face of seemingly apathetic governments and pandemic-related lockdowns, we explore a new film from award-winning documentary maker Ken Farrow that calls for endless resistance in the face of endless brutality. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground.